So I think that there's a really actually close connection between memory and democracy. Particularly, I think there's a really close connection between memory and any sort of substantive, any sort of these abstract ideas that we have that need to be made substantive. And in particular, I think sort of memory shapes how we fill this very abstract idea of democracy with content. And in particular, what democracy means in any given context. So I think this is really clear if you look at how Western Europeans in general view democracy compared to how post-communist Europeans view democracy. In the West, the image of democracy really comes right out of the crimes of the Holocaust and fascism, where the primary issue that occurred during the Third Reich was the massive expropriation of human rights from individuals, which was kind of a necessary precondition for sort of mass killings in the gas chambers, right? In order to kill those people, you had to take away their rights first. And the worry is, right, that, I mean, those kind of things can be done in a majoritarian democracy, right? Hannah Arendt famously, in The Origins of Totalitarianism, talked about the possibility that a given community could quite democratically vote to take away the rights of a group within itself. And so what you get in sort of Western Europe after World War II is a conception of democracy that is really based on democracy as protecting fundamental rights and sort of restraining the amount of power that voters have to sort of, through these majoritarian mechanisms, actually take away rights, right? So that's a very kind of this constrained image of, negative or liberal democracy, where democracy is fundamentally about the protection of certain kinds of rights. By contrast, in post-communist Europe, the image of democracy is very different, because although there were rights violations in the East during communism, the primary experience of the people was the loss of sort of domestic control, the loss of popular sovereignty, which was perceived to have been sort of handed over not only just to the Communist Party in the state, but more generally to the Communist Party in Moscow, where sort of all of the important decisions were ultimately made. And if sort of the local parties did not sort of follow the decisions that were made in Moscow, then the tanks would sort of roll into your country, right? The Red Army would come in to ensure that they were. And so in the aftermath of 1989, democracy in that part of the world is not associated with sort of the protection of rights with liberal democracy, but with the ability to make your own decisions. So with popular sovereignty, and in particular, sort of with national sovereignty. And so I think that shows really well how there's a really close connection between memory and how we conceptualize democracy. And I think it also explains why Western and Eastern Europe, or even in the institutions of the EU and Eastern Europe, are at loggerheads about what democracy really means. Is democracy about separation of powers and rights protection, right? This kind of juridical model that the EU has, or is democracy about popular sovereignty, about majoritarianism, about making your own decisions? And although I think sort of both of those models can get abused in various ways, right? The Western model can get abused by sort of elites who want to do unpopular things and don't want to have to be answerable to the people. And the Eastern model can get abused by leaders who sort of want to entrench their power and ensure that they can do whatever they want. But the whole point is that I think actually both of those models of democracy are legitimate interpretations of that term. And both of them have roots in sort of democratic theory. If you think about sort of, the liberal tradition and the more Republican tradition associated with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And which of those models sort of any society follows or thinks is right is deeply shaped by their own historical experiences and how those experiences shape what they think in the present and how they imagine their futures. Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of mechanisms that are really important. Obviously, sort of the exact form depends on the context and the pre-existing histories that politicians can sort of manipulate and take advantage of. But I think the real primary way is through these narratives of victimhood, right? And I think that that is primarily what is happening right now in the kind of illiberal democracies of East Central Europe, where the claim to victimization, the claim that sort of Germany never fully reconciled or sort of paid enough reparations to those societies, that's used as a kind of rhetorical cudgel to prevent sort of Germany and the West from being sort of allowed, from having the moral standing to question the democratic legitimacy of those societies, right? So I think in that sense, sort of the status of victimhood and the mobilization around that status of victimhood is really powerful, both in terms of sort of mobilizing local populations, but also as a way of trying to shape international public opinion and to sort of redirect attention away from sort of what is happening domestically or what those leaders are doing towards sort of these kind of international conflicts. So I think that's a mechanism, this kind of competition for victimhood as a way of covering up what you're doing domestically, I think is really a powerful mechanism of memory politics. I mean, I think there's, right, I mean, the memory boom, as it gets called, right, I mean, it really dates back to the 1980s, even the late 70s. So I think it's been something that's been happening for a while. I think it also, right, why it's happening now is, again, dependent on the local contexts. I think in East Central Europe, there was a kind of real freeze of a lot of these memory conflicts during communism when people weren't allowed to bring up anything other than the official narrative. And then there was also this kind of second, it wasn't quite a freeze, but it was almost a decision not to have those conversations while the states were unified in seeking membership of the European Union. And now sort of the fact that that goal has been achieved, that goal that sort of served to enforce a kind of truce, that's brought open all these memory conflicts in East Central Europe, not only about communism, but even about what happened during Nazi occupations in those societies. I think another real driver over the last 10 years or so has just been economic hardship, right? Dating back to kind of the global financial crisis and the Eurozone crisis, right? Those kind of hard economic times and the inability of states to sort of deal with them, especially states in the South and East that were hardest hit, it sort of encouraged governments to take advantage of memory issues or to sort of draw on memory issues to kind of redirect attention outward, right? Again, especially it worked well for the Greeks to sort of not only make the claim to Germans, well, look, you know, it's in your interest to sort of support us because if we crash out of the euro, that will affect you in all sorts of negative ways economically. But it's also then in your moral interest because look at, you know, the Greek Civil War, we were never compensated for this, right? So I think that that's also really driven it, that the hard times bring out the memory issues can sort of redirect attention and can then be also used to reinforce certain claims for economic support. So I think that that's also kind of that guilting and again, the competition for victimhood, those kind of things are more likely to come out during times when sort of the economics falter during wars and other conflicts. So I think this sort of, especially over the past decade, the economic situation really has been a driver of that. And, you know, rising inflation now, the war in Ukraine, the energy crisis, I think those are all, again, kinds of economic issues that are more likely to, again, be used by politicians or to sort of, where politicians are once again going to be encouraged to use memory politics to kind of redirect attention away from those issues or to kind of redirect blame for the problems onto other people. So I think that's a real driver of kind of the increasing salience of memory politics recently.